About 6 months after I realized that I need to take this job on, I called a meeting of a whole bunch of my friends from around the country, professors at Mayo, at Hopkins, at Harvard, Stanford, in Ann Arbor, and said, guys, how do we deal with this? And we realized that we couldn't do it through our usual routes. You know, the universities have real limits in terms of what they can do. The aid agencies we found really weren't dealing with disability at all, especially at the medical side like we knew how to do. And we realized we had to come up with a different organization. We formed this group called the International Rehabilitation Forum. It's had huge success with very, very little funding by taking a very contrarian approach to life. So we just hold a meeting and people come, you know. We decide that Ghana is our laboratory to get things done for the world and make lots of noise about it, and all of a sudden young students and residents and other people say, hey, I want to go to Ghana for a while, or I don't know where I want to go, but I'll help. And we say, Ghana, that's our spot. And over time we're hammering away at Africa by working through Ghana. We do a lot of crazy things because it's the only way to deal with this crazy situation. Maybe the best example is when one of my students was tasked with finding out how many rehabilitation doctors there were in Africa. And he did a very comprehensive review, spent months at it, and his total answer was 6. Okay? There are probably 6 rehab doctors sitting in a cafe next to you right now. There's 6 in Africa, there are 8,000 in the United States, 10,000 in China, 6. And so we wrote the paper, and I couldn't sleep at night. I just thought, this is just disgusting. I mean, I've seen it, I know it, but it was just my little town in Ghana or my little town in Liberia. I didn't realize that all of Africa, you could be the richest man in Africa, and if you got in a car accident, there's nobody to show up in the intensive care unit and take care of the rehabilitation needs. So it really didn't sit well with me that I was simply going to publish this little paper with 6 research subjects, and it's not good science. And one night I was just worried about this in the middle of the night, and I realized that I need to get a little bit sarcastic and compare this to the European White Paper, which is a document about this thick that lists how many doctors are in Europe and what they're training in and what their expertise is and what the future of research is. So I started writing out the White Book on Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation in Africa. So I called up my friend Brian Krayback, who's an ultramarathon guy who had actually spent a few days in Antarctica. And I thought, what the hell? There's no rehab in Antarctica, there's no rehab in Africa. Let's cover all the continents that haven't been covered in one big white book. So we wrote this document, and the first half is really tongue-in-cheek. I mean, I'll never forget the first graphic that says number of rehabilitation doctors per 100 million people in Africa and Antarctica, and there's no data. It's completely flat because there aren't any, you know. And so there's this kind of a thing where we talked about the methods, you know. We went to all the national organizations in Africa, having found none. We went to all the universities in Africa that teach rehabilitation, having found none. We went to all the practitioners in Africa, having found none. We called up my friend Deji Adewale, who grew up in Africa, and asked him to be our Africa representative, and so we had this commission, right? So it's all tongue-in-cheek, it's all goofy. And then the last half is hammering away at the reasons why. And these are the things that have really been our calling card. The reasons why there isn't rehabilitation in Africa don't have to do with all the people are poor, okay? There are more Mercedes in South Africa than you need to have a rehab doctor supported by Mercedes owners, let alone the Fords and the Chryslers and the other cars like that. Every city in Africa has enough rich people to support having a rehab doctor, let alone the poor people. So it's not about poverty. It's about governments that are stuck in their ways. It's about world policy. It's about really old-fashioned British model medical schools. The British have moved on, but Africa hasn't. And it's about some really ingrained prejudices. You know, in some places, if your child has a disability, it's because you had sex in the bush, or it's because your family was cursed by somebody, and the answer is throw them in a garbage bin or something like that. So we go on to all these issues in this paper. Now the crazy thing is that when I mentioned this to my friends who are editors of some of the medical journals, they scooped it up and they did something that has never been done in the history of medicine as far as I can tell. The rule in medicine is you got a research paper, you publish it in one journal. That's all you get, right? Well, 5 different journals decided simultaneously that this was such an important thing that it needed to be spread all over to all their different audiences. So all of a sudden I'm looking at the Chinese Journal of Rehab Medicine, the journal Disability and Rehabilitation, the American journal called Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. 5 different journals publishing this simultaneously. Never happened in the history of the world. And the point of it was that our little dinky organization put some spin on the ball, and it was really a shot across the bow. That thing is now being quoted over and over again as a major policy statement just because we were a bunch of goofballs.